is an Egyptian prince doing out in the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula? Well, there's a long story behind that, isn't there? He was an adoptive son of the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. That came about when the Pharaoh issued a decree to kill the baby boys of the Hebrew race that were or had become slaves in Egypt. And you know the story from childhood, how Moses' mother, when she saw Moses, said he is a good child, a beautiful child, and she did all she could to protect him from the actions of the Pharaoh. You recall that she created a basket, covered it with pitch so that it would float in the Nile. And Moses' sister Miriam watched over that so that when the Egyptians came to their house, he would not be there. As it happened, the princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, was bathing with some of her maidens in the Nile and heard the cry of a baby. And she discovered that it was a Hebrew child, and she saw that this was a beautiful child as well, and she wanted to adopt the child. You recall that Miriam came forth from hiding and said, may I find a Hebrew nurse for this child? And so she found Moses' mother, so that in the early years, he was raised by his mother, nurtured by her and the family. People nursed, children nursed in those days longer than they do in our culture, and so he was probably about 3 before he went to the royal family. And there he received one of the best educations that a person could receive in the world at that time. This was 3,500 years before Christ, and even at that time, which we think is ancient, the Egyptian civilization was far more ancient. It had been there for centuries. And many of you have been to Egypt and have seen the wisdom of Egypt displayed in the architecture there and in many of the artifacts that are now available. And so Moses has one foot in the Hebrew culture, probably had less contact with that culture over time as he was being educated by the best of the Egyptian scholars. It's interesting that Stephen, in the Acts of the Apostles, reflects on what happened to him. Here's what Stephen says. When Moses was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his relatives, the Hebrews. When he saw one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man, avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his kinfolk would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. And as you remember, when Moses struck down the Egyptian taskmaster, it was a fatal blow. And Moses looked around to see who was watching. He couldn't see anyone. But the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews quarreling with each other, and he sought to be a mediator in that conflict. And one of the Hebrews said to him, "Are you proposing to be a ruler over us? Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" And so Moses knew that the word was out of what he had done to the Egyptian. It didn't take long for that word to get to the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh moved Moses up to the top of Egypt's most wanted list. And so Moses had to flee. That's when he came into the land of Midian, and when he went there, he went to a well where people met. That was the place where people came together. And some young women were watering their sheep, and other shepherds were driving them away, and Moses intervened. He seemed to have a heart for people who were being persecuted, and so he was able to drive the shepherds away. He didn't kill them as he did the Egyptian, but he did manage to get them away. When the girls got back to their father, Jethro, the priest, he said, "Why are y'all back so early?" One of the daughters spoke up and said, "This Egyptian came and drove the shepherds away, so we were able to get our watering done a little early." And the priest said, "This Egyptian, why didn't you ask him to come home to dinner?" So they went back and retrieved Moses, and he married one of those girls, Zipporah, and had children by her. And served as the shepherd of his father-in-law Jethro there in the wilderness. So he's in the foothills of Sinai, or Horeb, Mount Horeb, and that's how he got there. As he's there, he sees a flicker of light and notices the bush that's on fire. Now, that may not have been the first time that he had seen a bush burning in the wilderness. Given that very hot climate, the dryness and so forth, it's not unusual for a bush to burn in that climate. But there was something unusual about this bush, wasn't there? He noticed that it was burning, but it was not consumed. And that really got his attention. If something is burning and not being consumed, it's like the one who ordered all things to be as they are has somehow intervened here. And so he was curious, his curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to get a little bit closer. As he sought to get closer, a voice came out of this burning bush, "Moses, Moses." And of course he responded by saying, "Here I am." The repetition of a person's name in Scripture like that is seen often. We see it in Jesus, at times calling his disciples twice by name. The voice urges him not to come any closer because he is standing on holy ground. And then the voice introduces himself a little bit more to Moses. He says, "I am the God of your father. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And when he said that, Moses hid his face. Now, there are a number of reasons why he might have hidden his face after God spoke to him. One is when we are in the presence of holiness, we feel an impact from that holiness. And so that is one possibility. Another possibility that I'd like to suggest is that Moses, with all of his education in the Egyptian culture, knew something about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the people that were his people, the Hebrews. But Egypt was a country of many gods, a polytheistic country. There was a god for every task. And another factor is that in those times, a god was measured by the success of the people who worshiped him. And when you compare the sophisticated Egyptian culture with the slaves, the Hebrew slaves, Moses probably thought that this God that he may have heard a little about from the Hebrews was not very powerful at all. If he were powerful, why would he allow them to become slaves like they were? And so probably early in his adulthood, he left aside this communication about God from his own people. And he may have still had the Egyptian gods in mind. But here he was at the foothill of this mountain, and this voice speaks to him with the fire in the bush, and it causes him to hide his face. After all, he realized that this God of my father and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is real, and I am face to face with him. The Lord speaks further to Moses at this point. He uses a lot of perceptual verbs. He says, I have observed the misery of my people. I see them. I see the hurt. I have heard their cry. I know their suffering. It doesn't stop there. Perception and knowledge with God leads to action. God not only sees misery, sees hurt, hears crying, but he is in the process of doing something. He says, I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and I am going to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. He again emphasizes the hearing and seeing after he tells them, or he tells Moses that he's going to bring him to a good land. He says, the cry of the Israelites has come to me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. And then, again, action, but not just God's action. He says, Moses, I want you to go down and confront Pharaoh and bring this people out of Egypt. So God is not just reporting what God is going to do. He's saying, Moses, I want you to go and do that. That's when he asks the question, who am I? Who am I? Now, that question might seem like a cop-out, Moses wanting to get out of this task that God's laying on him. But I'd like to suggest that question, who am I to do this, is a very wise and really a humble question. I think when Moses was a young man in Egypt and he took up whatever physical measure against the Egyptian taskmaster, I think he thought he could free his people eventually. But the experience that he had had over the next few years brought to him the reality that he was unable to do that. And so it was very wise of him to say, who am I? Who am I to do this? What was God's response to him? He says, Moses, I will be with you. I will be with you. Now that phrase in English, sometimes we may think is sort of trite. When someone tells us of a problem, a situation they're in, and we tell them, I pray that God will be with you. People may take that lightly. But when we think about that, when God is with a person, is there anything better than that? So Moses began to change his mind about the task of going down there. He realized that it would be very difficult to separate this people from Pharaoh. Actually, over, in addition to the Nile River, this people, this slave people, was probably the greatest asset that the Pharaoh had. All of us know that labor is expensive. When you get your car just routinely serviced, you get the invoice, you see the cost of the parts, and then you see the labor. And in my experience, labor is always a lot more than the parts. And so to take these slaves away from Egypt at this time, it would have been unthinkable. So think what it would take to separate these slaves from Pharaoh. Moses then asks for a sign. He wants a sign that God is with him. And the sign that God gives him is this. He says, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Now, on the face of that, that's a very curious sign. He's saying to Moses, my sign to you that you're to do this is that when you get it all done, you're going to be out here on Sinai worshiping God with these people. But he needed more assurance than that, and he would get it, as you know. But I think what God was doing was fixing in his mind the vision of this nation of Israel being moved from Egypt to Sinai, where they would covenant with God, where they would become a nation in their own right. And so, as I said, God would provide other signs along the way, including the 10 plagues. It would take those 10 plagues to have Pharaoh release his grip on the Israelites. The last question that Moses asked is, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? I think Moses realized that his first selling job in this task was not dealing with Pharaoh, but he had to convince the Israelites that he was representing God, that God was with him, and that God would make this successful. And so he anticipated the question that they would have. In a polytheistic culture, people always wanted to know the name of a god. In Egypt, there was a whole hierarchy of gods, as we have mentioned. They had different ranks, they had different tasks, all the way from running the big things in the universe down to the most trivial things. And so it was in that context that Moses wanted to be able to give the name of the God in order to convince the Hebrews that God was with him. But the answer that Moses is given by God is this: my name is I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. So you should say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. This I am that I am raises our minds far above the realm of many gods to the one who created and sustains heaven and earth, the one in whom everything else, on whom everything else is dependent. God is not dependent on anything. God is free. God is able to exercise his action according to his holy nature. And unlike you and me who are dependent on so many things, think about the oxygen that we're dependent upon at every moment. And the physicians in the room can enumerate a whole list of things, too numerous to count, of things within our body that we are dependent on. If we don't have them, things are going to go wrong. And so, unlike us, who are dependent on so many factors and ultimately on God himself, God is not dependent on anything. He is free. And the Egyptians who pose a threat to the Israelites, who seem an insurmountable obstacle to them being free, is nothing to I am that I am. This I am that I am gets translated into the word, it's the this is called and of course it's in Hebrew, in the original, called the Tetragrammaton. Simply means 4 letters, and it occurs 6,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. This is the name that is so holy that the Jewish people will not pronounce it. When they are reading the scripture and they come to the 6,000 instances of Yahweh, they substitute another Hebrew word, Adonai, for it. So holy is the name of these 4 letters that they will simply not pronounce it. And I'm told that some of the scribes, in copying the Hebrew scriptures, when they write this name, throw away the quill or the writing instrument with which they're writing. They do it one time and then they throw it away. I don't know that that's true in all cases, but in some groups of copiers, that's the way they did it. We are, like Moses, we are allergic to holiness. In our nature as sinners, we avoid holiness. But the marvelous thing about God is that he works in us to overcome that allergy to holiness, because our complete well-being, all that he has made us to be, depends on our taking in his holiness, being restored to the image of God, which is holy. One picture of that from the New Testament, you recall when Jesus was looking for disciples, he knew some of these men, had relationship with them before he called them. And in one scene from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, you recall that Peter and the other disciples that were fishermen were out all night, one night fishing. And when they came to shore, Jesus was there, and he asked them, "How did it go, fellas?" And they said, "We caught nothing last night." And so Jesus says, "Cast your nets on the other side. You've been fishing on the wrong side." And when they did, the catch was so great, it was breaking the nets, and it took 2 boats. They had to bring in a second boat to take in all the fish that were caught at the Lord's direction. And Peter, when he saw this, he said, Lord, get away from me. Get away from me. Depart from me. I am a sinful man. And the Lord said to him, he said, Peter, said, come to me. You are going to be catching men from now on. So that's a picture of how God takes us in our unholiness. He comes into our lives and he removes that sinfulness, those sinful tendencies, and replaces it with his own holiness. Paul, in his second letter to the Corinthians, gave a picture of this. He said, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as through a reflected mirror, are being transformed into that same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. We are being transformed. We're not the same as we were. We're not the same as we will be. We are being transformed by his glory, his holy glory, into his likeness. Any observations that you have on Moses on holy ground? Yes, Dave?
Just a question, Steve. In Matthew, when Jesus was preaching the Sermon on the Mountain, he gave us the Lord's Prayer, and he started it out, Our Father. Do you know what word, he was speaking Aramaic, do you know what word he was using for Our Father? Was it like this?
Was it Hebrew? We only have it in Greek, I think. So I don't, I think there are Aramaic translations of the New Testament that could probably give that, but I don't know that specific word.
Would it have been similar to what God was saying, I am?
I think Father would be different. It's interesting, in the Gospel of John, you have this I am appearing many times in Jesus' sayings, and the Hebrew leaders picked up on that. They understood that he was claiming identity with I am. In fact, one of his sayings was, before Abraham was, I am. And I think that nearly led to violence when he said that. Yeah. Good question, very good question.
So what did he use, what word did he use to say I am? Was it one word or was it?
It is,
In John.
in John, it's ego eimi in Greek. The Hebrew is actually 3 words, and I don't have that before me.
We're really testing you.
Yeah, yeah. I failed both I failed my Aramaic and Hebrew test this morning. Yes, Maria.
Going back to John, when he says, at the beginning was the verb.
Yes. Beginning was the word.
Yeah.
Yes.
He says, I am. He doesn't even name it. He says, I am.
Right.
The word.
Yes, I am is above every particular thing, isn't it? It's everything. Yes, yes, yes.
Isn't Abba another word for father?
Abba, yes.
And what is that like?
Abba is Hebrew and Aramaic. Jack?
Steve, I'm not gonna ask you a question that you can't answer today. It's just an observation on something that you said. when you were talking about oxygen and all the complexities or all the things in the body that we depend upon, naturally I started thinking about those things. And I can think of no better evidence than our God, than the complexity and the individuality of the human organism.
Oh, yeah,
There's just no way that you can explain this in any other way.
exactly, exactly. Yes. Thank you for that. You and I have talked about that complexity, and that came to mind as I was preparing and comparing us to God, who is in no way dependent on anything else.
So what is holy ground for us today?
Holy ground. It's wherever God appears.
That's wherever we have an inkling of God being with us, that's holy ground.
Yes, yes. And every centimeter of the universe is a possible revelation of His holiness. Yes, Jim?
Thinking this lesson, if we're gonna go back to what God is and what God's telling us, go to Deuteronomy, go to the Shema, and read the Shema. It basically, if you're translating English, you would say, he says, "Hear, O Israel, I am your God, I am one." I am one. And that's where it all begins, because that was Jesus' greatest sin. Comparing himself and using himself in relationship, I think, to God.
Right.
Calling him, using those terms.
Well, what the world view of people up until Jesus came thought that God being one could not mean that God could become human flesh. And the incarnation is a great mystery. It's a great mystery, but it is the basis of our faith in Jesus, that the Word has become flesh and dwelt among us. Not only that, we get to the third person of the Trinity, where Jesus puts in us, when we come to Him, God. He puts God within us in His Spirit. Yes.
So to add on to that thought about where is holy ground, then our hearts where Jesus resides
Yes.
is holy ground.
Yes.
Which would call us to realize that and to walk in a way that's holy, and our lives are other places in Scripture,
Yeah.
temple of the Holy Spirit. So we need to walk uprightly and love justice, have mercy,
Yes.
be holy as
Yes.
He is.
Another kind of figure is coming out of, or as part of the Exodus, they created the tabernacle. And that was seen as the place where God dwelt with His people. Later, under Solomon, they built the temple, and that was seen as the place where heaven and earth meet. But with the coming of Jesus, with His imparting the Holy Spirit to us, we become the temple of God. Each one of you is a temple, the place where heaven and earth meet.
Steve, do you think that holy ground could be anywhere that you are in communication with God, on your knees, praying to Him?
Oh, certainly, certainly.
So then, holy ground could be in an eminent number of places in this world.
There's no limit on where God.
Steve, one more thing, then I promise I'll shut up or I'll try. I love it. This is so interesting, and I love it. You know what is interesting to me, because the Shema is the whole deal. And when Jesus came, they could not understand that they were limiting God by saying God could not be a human.
Right.
And God.
Right.
And to me, that's just, all of a sudden, God is the greatest thing, it's it, there's nothing else, boom, boom, boom. And when God makes a different, I'm trying to think of the word, a decision, that's not the right word, but a decision to come down as man, it could not be accepted. It was more than they could understand.
Right, it stretched the mind so much.
Yeah.
And we're still, in our minds, we still wrestle with that.